the night of October 30th, 1503, inside the Apostolic Palace of the Vatican, the heart of Christendom turned into something that looked far closer to hell. Under vaulted ceilings painted to honour the divine, 50 naked courtesans crawled across freezing marble, their bare hands scraping over cold stone as cardinals in scarlet watched in paralysed silence. Heavy incense clung to the air like a lie. The flicker of candlelight slid over crucifixes, gilded saints, and the jewelled fingers of men who had sworn vows of chastity. At the centre of it all, seated on a raised platform as if presiding over a mass, sat Pope Alexander VI. He was not praying, he was laughing. Each time one of the women slipped or stumbled, his shoulders shook with amusement. Each time a cardinal flinched, he turned his head to study their discomfort, like a man savouring a rare wine. What witnesses saw that night was not a rumour, not an exaggeration, but something so violently opposed to the idea of sanctity that even hardened chroniclers centuries later would stop their pens, unsure how to set it down on paper without feeling complicit. And yet, what unfolded in that banquet hall was only the climax of a much longer nightmare. Because this was not simply a feast, it was a wedding night, and the bride, Lucrezia Borgia, was about to be offered up as the final sacrifice. To understand how a papal palace became a stage for humiliation, you have to return to the autumn of 1503, when the bells of St. Peter's rang out across Rome with news that gripped Italy by the throat. The Pope had announced that his daughter Lucrezia, twice widowed, twice surrounded by the stench of suspicious death, would marry again. No quiet provincial ceremony, no distant castle. Her third marriage would be celebrated inside the Vatican itself, in the papal apartments, beneath frescoes meant to represent heaven's judgment. The groom chosen was Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. On parchment, the match was brilliant, the Borgia Pope tying his blood to one of the oldest and most respected noble dynasties in Italy. But in Ferrara, the news landed like a death sentence. Everyone knew Lucrezia's past. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, had fled Rome muttering about assassins and poison. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, had been strangled on Vatican steps, with whispers pointing directly to her brother, Cesare Borgia. Now, another Alfonso, another political pawn, was being summoned into the family's orbit. To outside observers, this was a glittering alliance. To Alfonso d'Este, it felt like walking into a beautifully decorated execution chamber. Desperate to avoid the noose tightening around his neck, Alfonso tried everything a prince could try without openly provoking war. He delayed his departure, he sent careful letters, he floated polite excuses and diplomatic objections. Maybe the timing was inconvenient, maybe the political climate unstable, but Alexander VI was not a man who accepted no from anyone beneath him, and in his world, that meant everyone. Messengers galloped back and forth between Rome and Ferrara with a simple, brutal message: accept this marriage or be destroyed. If the Este dared resist, Ferrara would face Cesare's merciless armies, the same forces that had reduced proud cities to smoking, obedient shells. Excommunication would follow, stripping the Este of legitimacy, allies, and any shred of divine protection. Italy had already learned the lesson. No one survived an open conflict with the Borgias. Realizing that pride might cost him his dynasty, Duke Ercole d'Este bowed to reality. His son would go to Rome, he would marry the Pope's daughter, and whether he survived the experience or not was no longer the family's concern. He had become a calculated offering. While negotiations and threats flew back and forth, Lucrezia herself stood in a gilded cage at the heart of it all. In her Vatican apartments, overlooking the tangle of Rome's alleys and domes, she stared out with an expression far too old for her 21 years. To Europe, she was the poisonous siren of the Borgia clan, seductress, schemer, accessory to murder. Pamphlets painted her as a witch in silk, dripping venom from her smile. But the people who actually lived around her saw something very different. They saw a young woman used like a chess piece on a board she did not control. Her first marriage had been ripped apart the moment it stopped serving her father's plans, annulled with humiliating claims about her husband's manhood. Her second husband, the one man she truly loved, had been killed so close to her that she heard his screams. She'd not ordered his death. She'd not chosen his fate. She had simply watched as the two men who truly ruled her life, her father and brother, decided he no longer fit their design. Her maids whispered that Lucrezia sometimes woke in the middle of the night gasping, clutching at her chest as if stabbed in her sleep. She never spoke about those dreams. She knew this third marriage would not bring love. But even she could not imagine the spectacle her wedding night would become. Inside the Vatican, preparations for the marriage moved quickly, but not joyfully. The palace felt like a suffocating machine grinding toward a predetermined end. Servants kept their eyes on the floor and their voices low. Cardinals passed each other in corridors with tight, strained smiles. Strange visitors, men and women who looked more at home in Roman pleasure houses than in papal halls, slipped in through side entrances at odd hours. Rumors spread like smoke. There would be a special banquet, special entertainers, special instructions. Somewhere in the middle of this tightening spiral stood one man whose entire job was to keep order, Johann Burchard, the Vatican's master of ceremonies. Burchard had already seen more scandal under Alexander VI than most men could stomach in 10 lifetimes. Sacred offices sold like market wares, bribes disguised as gifts, feasts that bordered on obscene. But as he read through the plans for Lucrezia's wedding, a cold unease took root in his chest. Something was different this time. Something felt deliberate, constructed, as if the entire night was being engineered to shatter boundaries that should never be touched. He sensed, long before the first goblet of wine was poured, that he was about to record an event history would struggle to look at directly. In December, Alfonso d'Este finally entered Rome with a small escort. His ride through the winter landscape had been miserable. Frozen roads, hostile winds, nights filled with a growing dread he could not shake. But nothing he'd seen on the journey prepared him for the stone giant that was the Vatican. Rising above the city, half bathed in candlelight, half covered in scaffolding and shadows, it did not resemble the beating heart of Christ's church. It looked like a fortress raised to swallow anyone foolish enough to walk through its gates. Inside, the welcome was overwhelming, smothering him beneath layers of theatre. Alexander VI sat upon his throne drenched in white and gold, his vestments catching the light like molten metal. Beside him stood Cesare, wearing armor that seemed almost ceremonial in its perfection, his expression unreadable. He was only 26, but Italy already knew his name like a curse. Families disappeared when he wanted them gone. Towns surrendered at the sight of his banner. When his eyes found Alfonso's, there was no warmth, no kinship, nothing human. The glance said everything. You are not a guest here. You are a possession. The weeks that followed were one long, unspoken humiliation. Banquets were thrown in Alfonso's honor, but each one felt like a veiled threat. He found himself seated near courtesans while high-ranking clergy watched with lazy, amused eyes. On hunts, Cesare displayed a ruthless skill with bow and spear that seemed tailored to send a message: I know how to stalk, chase, and kill. During formal receptions, Alexander spoke openly of the tragic misfortunes that had claimed Lucrezia's previous husbands, his tone hovering somewhere between regret and mockery. Every comment, every carefully staged moment, pressed the same truth into Alfonso's mind. You belong to us now. There is no road home that does not pass through our mercy. And while he endured this tightening psychological siege, something even darker was taking shape beneath his feet. Cesare personally took charge of the wedding night feast, pushing the plans past even Rome's notorious standards for decadence. Behind locked doors, he met with his father to refine the details, and the details were horrifying. 50 of the most beautiful courtesans in Rome were selected, not merely prostitutes, but educated, refined women who moved easily through the salons of the elite. Many had entertained princes and ambassadors. Now they were summoned to serve the Pope. They were ordered to dress in rich velvet and silk, instructed with icy clarity that these garments would not remain on their bodies for long. Led through hidden passageways by lamplight, they were delivered to secret rooms beneath the palace, out of sight but not out of mind. Servants who saw them pass whispered prayers under their breath, crossing themselves with shaking fingers. They did not know exactly what was planned. They didn't need to. The fear in the women's eyes was enough. Even Lucrezia, deliberately shut out of most of the preparations to spare her nerves, could feel the darkness building. Her maids reported strangers moving through the halls, courtesans appearing where they did not belong, Cesare gliding from room to room with a smile that looked more like a knife than an expression. On the night before the ceremony, suffocating beneath the weight of what she could not see but could feel, Lucrezia fled to the Sistine Chapel. Beneath the painted vault, beneath the hand of God reaching toward Adam, she collapsed to her knees. She did not pray for romance or for happiness. She prayed for escape, for interruption, for something, anything that would shatter this path before it reached its end. The chapel gave her nothing. The great painted figures on the ceiling did not move. The silence pressed down as heavily as her own fate. The candles shivered in the winter draught, as if even their flames were struggling to stay alive inside these walls. At dawn on October 30th, the wedding day, Rome exploded into spectacle. Bells roared across the 7 hills. Crowds jammed the streets around the Vatican, craning their necks for a glimpse of the infamous bride. Inside, Lucrezia was dressed like a vision conjured from a painter's dream. A gown of shimmering silk embroidered with gold that caught the candlelight like fire. Her long bright hair braided with strings of pearls. Her skin was powdered to a fragile paleness, hiding the dark hollows beneath her eyes. When she looked in the mirror, she did not see a radiant bride. She saw something prepared, arranged, and offered, a sacrifice wrapped in silk. The ceremony itself took place in a papal chapel, drowning in gold and holy images. Alexander VI officiated personally, his booming voice echoing over polished marble as he bound Alfonso and Lucrezia before God. Cardinals in scarlet lined the walls, their faces arranged in the same carefully neutral expressions they used at every major event. But behind the practiced piety, something else flickered. Unease. They knew the Borgia reputation. They felt the wrongness in the air. This did not feel like a sacrament. It felt like a prelude. Once the vows were spoken and the last prayer muttered, the procession moved from the chapel to the Borgia apartments, halls painted with scenes of saints and heroes by masters like Pinturicchio. Those walls had been meant to inspire devotion. Tonight they would serve as the backdrop for something that mocked the very idea. The banquet began like any other display of papal wealth. Enormous tables heaved under roasted boar, pheasants still feathered in gold leaf, pyramids of exotic fruit, and rivers of wine from the finest vineyards of Italy. Music from lutes and viols floated gently through the hall. Cardinals, Roman nobles, Ferrara's envoys, and hand-picked courtiers took their places, trading smooth compliments and rehearsed jokes. Alfonso and Lucrezia sat at the head table side by side, but miles apart inside their own dread. For a while, everything remained within the boundaries of ordinary excess. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell. Yet beneath the surface, something waited. As the night deepened and the wine flowed, Alexander grew louder, more flushed, more triumphant. Then Cesare, who had been silent, rose. With the smallest tilt of his head, he gave the signal. The enormous doors of the hall slammed shut. Guards stepped forward to lock them, hands resting on their sword hilts. No one would be leaving, not yet. What followed would be remembered forever by a name whispered in disgust: the Banquet of the Chestnuts. When the doors closed, a strange hush swept across the hall. Conversations died mid-sentence. Musicians faltered, their fingers freezing on strings. Even the drunkest guests sensed that the air had changed. Alexander VI sat back on his throne, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. At a gesture from Cesare, the side doors opened, and 50 courtesans stepped inside. They were draped in velvet and jewels, their bodies glittering in the candlelight, but nothing could hide the fear in their faces. Some stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the cardinals and nobles crowding the room. Others glanced around in quick, panicked flickers, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed. For a heartbeat, the Vatican's most powerful men simply stared, as if their minds could not connect what they were seeing with where they were sitting. Then Alexander rose. Smiling, as if unveiling some grand, harmless surprise, the Pope announced that the true entertainment of the evening was about to begin. At his command, the courtesans were ordered to remove their clothes. One by one, trembling hands reached for ties, laces, and clasps. Velvet and silk slid from shoulders and waists and pooled at bare feet. Jewels that had once adorned their bodies now lay abandoned on the floor, forgotten in the shadow of what was happening. In a hall built for prayer, under frescoed ceilings and the watchful eyes of the painted saints, 50 women stood naked before men who wore the colours of the church. The divide between sacred and profane shattered in an instant. Some cardinals turned their faces away, tracing frantic crosses on their chests, silently begging God not to see what they were seeing. Others stared, stunned, unable to look away. A few, already drunk, laughed nervously, trying to turn terror into amusement. Anyone who tried to stand or move toward the door quickly noticed the guards, swords, armor, impassive faces. There would be no retreat, no polite escape into the night. Everyone in that hall was trapped inside the Pope's vision. Then came the next order. The women were commanded to dance between the tables, weaving through the forest of goblets and plates, past the heavy robes of princes of the church. Servants lit towering candelabras, raising a ring of firelight around the scene. Flames flared and bent, throwing jagged shadows onto the frescoed walls. Naked figures slipped in and out of the golden glow, their movements stiff, mechanical, a grotesque parody of celebration. Their bodies became silhouettes cast across the painted forms of saints and angels, as if the holy images themselves were being forced to witness what had become of the Vatican they adorned. It was not a dance. It was a parade of fear. But Alexander was not finished. He wanted more than shock. He wanted humiliation. At his signal, servants brought in baskets overflowing with chestnuts and scattered them across the polished marble floor. The nuts rolled and clicked between the guests' feet, bouncing against table legs in a strange hollow music. Then, with casual cruelty, the Pope announced the next part of his game. The courtesans were to crawl on all fours between the tables, between the legs of cardinals and nobles, picking up the chestnuts like animals. He promised rewards for the women who gathered the most. Fine garments, gold jewelry, treasures from the papal stores, as if this was simply a contest at a festival and not a calculated act of degradation orchestrated by the head of the church. What followed tore something essential out of the Vatican's soul. 50 naked women fell to their hands and knees and crawled across the stone floor while men in scarlet and purple watched, laughed, or wept in silence. Alexander and Cesare sat above them on a raised platform, betting on which women would collect the most chestnuts, pointing and commenting as if they were attending a cheap spectacle in a seedy tavern, not overseeing a ritual at the center of Western Christianity. Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies, hardened by years of watching the worst excesses of this papacy, later wrote of the scene with a restraint that spoke louder than any decoration. He struggled to find words because even words felt too clean for what he had seen. Alfonso d'Este sat motionless, every drop of colour drained from his face. Nothing in his upbringing, no tale of Roman decadence, no whispered warning about the Borgias, had prepared him for this. This was his wedding feast. These were his guests. The man orchestrating this horror called himself the Vicar of Christ. Beside him, Lucrezia sat like a statue carved in ivory. Her wedding gown, once blazing with reflected light, now felt like a shroud wrapped around a living corpse. Tears streamed silently down her face, soaking into the silk, but her hands remained folded, fingers clenched so tightly her knuckles shone white. She did not scream, she did not flee. There was nowhere to go. As the night drew on and the last chestnut was gathered, Alexander signalled that the game was over. The courtesans slumped in corners, clutching whatever prizes they had been handed, too exhausted to even cover themselves properly. The tables were a ruin of spilled wine, crushed food, and broken restraint. Some cardinals had sunk into a stunned silence. Others hid their faces in their hands. If the night had ended here, it would still have been infamous. History would still have named it the Banquet of the Chestnuts. But Alexander wanted one last act, one last unspeakable demonstration of power. Near midnight, the hall fell utterly quiet as the Pope stood again. In a voice that cut through the chaos, he declared that the marriage between Alfonso and Lucrezia must now be verified in accordance with custom, not once, 3 times, and not in private. The consummation, he announced, would take place in a chamber adjoining the hall, its doors left open so that the witnesses, cardinals, nobles, courtiers, and even some of the courtesans could confirm the union without doubt. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Even Cesare, whose name was already soaked in blood, turned sharply toward his father, shocked by the sheer audacity of the command. Alfonso rose slowly, as if moving underwater. All his training, all his talk of honor and duty meant nothing now. There were guards between him and the exit. Cesare's men watched him with cold, unreadable eyes, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. There would be no refusal. He turned toward Lucrezia. She looked like a person whose spirit had stepped away from her body and left it behind to endure whatever came. Her lips moved in a whisper that no one heard. Together they walked toward the adjoining chamber, a room that had once hosted diplomatic discussions, now transformed into a bridal chamber, with its doors wide open, like a mouth. What happened next was not a union. It was an ordeal. Those who remained in the hall saw far too much and understood even more. Some prayed under their breath, clutching rosaries until their fingers went numb. Others wept in quiet, choked breaths. Even the courtesans, women used to the cruelty of men, looked away, their eyes shining with terrible recognition. This was not passion. This was not marriage. This was domination, stamped 3 times upon 2 human beings so that the Borgias could never be accused of arranging an invalid alliance. As the hours dragged on and Alexander's monstrous order unfolded step by step, a single realization settled over the Vatican like ash. Something sacred had died here, and it would not return. By the last hours of the night, Lucrezia was barely present. Her body moved because it had to. Her mind had retreated far away, fleeing into whatever darkness would have her. Alfonso, trembling and broken, had nothing left of the prince who had ridden into Rome weeks earlier. When the first thin light of dawn crept through the windows of the Borgia apartments, Alexander demanded that the third and final proof be completed. Cesare was there again, overseeing the proceedings with the same cold focus he used in war. When it was finally over, he declared the marriage triple bound, unchallengeable, unbreakable in the eyes of both church and law. Alexander lifted a cup of wine and smiled in satisfaction, as if approving a successful ceremony rather than presiding over a night that had crushed souls. Morning revealed the wreckage. The once splendid hall was littered with empty jugs, overturned cups, food ground into the marble floor, and chestnuts crushed beneath countless feet. Courtesans huddled in corners, wrapped in scraps of cloth, staring at nothing. Guards stood like statues, eyes downcast, complicit and ashamed. In the adjoining chamber, Lucrezia lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling as if it were impossibly far away. Her body was there. Her spirit was elsewhere. Alfonso sat at the edge of the bed, his hands shaking, his head buried in his palms. Whatever future he had imagined for himself, for his marriage, for his life in Ferrara, had been burned away in this one night. Within days he left Rome, slipping away with his new wife toward Ferrara. He would never speak of that night again, but silence could not bury what had happened. Word of the banquet began to leak out, first as whispers in Roman streets, then as rumours carried by merchants and diplomats, and finally as written reports sent to courts across Europe. Ambassadors wrote in cautious, coded phrases, terrified that too much honesty might cost them their positions or even their lives. Priests hinted at unspeakable scandals in their letters. The Venetian envoy supposedly wrote that what had occurred in the Vatican surpassed even the darkest excesses of ancient pagan Rome. The Borgias had already been feared. After this, they were hated. Preachers seized on the story as proof of the rot at Christianity's core. Among the voices rising in anger was that of an Augustinian monk in the German lands, a man named Martin Luther. Years later, when he would challenge the authorities of Rome and ignite the Protestant Reformation, he would point to the Borgia papacy and to this very feast as an emblem of everything that had gone wrong inside the church. The council halls, the pamphlets, the furious sermons. Behind all of them lurked the memory of a night when the Pope himself had turned the Vatican into a theatre of blasphemy. Johann Burchard, who had watched everything from beginning to end because it was his job, wrote it all down in his diary. His hand shook as he worked, not from fear of the Borgias, but from fear of history. He knew that his account might be buried by papal censors, never to see daylight. He also knew that if it survived, It would stand as one of the most damning testimonies ever recorded against the Church's highest office. Centuries later, when his diary resurfaced, the world would read those lines and feel the same cold that had gripped his pen. Lucrezia Borgia never escaped the shadow of that night. In Ferrara, she tried to build a quieter life. She supported artists, patronized writers, and gave generously to the poor. People who met her in those years often described a gentle, melancholy woman, more interested in prayer and poetry than intrigue. But behind the grace and the courtesy, there was always that flicker of sorrow, that distance in her gaze, as if part of her was still trapped in a candlelit hall in Rome, watching 50 women crawl over marble while her father laughed. She bore children with Alfonso. She fulfilled her duties as duchess. Yet their marriage, sealed under such monstrous circumstances, was not a romance. It was an arrangement sustained by duty and haunted by memory. At 39, while giving birth to her 8th child, Lucrezia's body finally gave out. On her deathbed, she asked for a priest and prayed until she could no longer speak. Her last recorded words were simple: "I am ready to be free at last." Freedom, a thing she'd never truly been granted in life. Not as a daughter, not as a wife, not as a pawn of her family's ambitions. Alexander VI did not outlive the stain he had created by much. He died months after the Banquet, with rumours swirling that the poison he had so often used against others had finally turned against him. Cesare, stripped of his power after his father's death, died in a lonely ambush in Spain, his body mutilated and dumped into an unmarked grave. The grand designs of the Borgia men ended not in glory, but in obscurity and blood. Yet the night of October 30th, 1503 did not die with them. It became a symbol, invoked again and again by reformers, historians and believers, trying to make sense of how corruption can take root in the holiest places. It helped fuel the fires that tore Western Christianity in half, and forced the Church to look, however reluctantly, into the mirror. Even now, more than 500 years later, the Banquet of the Chestnuts and the triple humiliation that followed are not just lurid footnotes in a history book. They are warnings. They remind us that the darkest acts are often committed not in caves or back alleys, but in palaces under frescoed ceilings and beside altars. They show us what happens when absolute power is wrapped in sacred robes and allowed to believe it answers to no one, not to law, not to conscience, not even to God. If you've walked with us through this entire descent into the Vatican's most infamous night, write boo in the comments so we know you reached the end. And if the hidden horrors of the past fascinate you, if you want more stories that peel back the gold to show the rot beneath, subscribe us, turn on the notifications, and share this video with someone who still believes the past is harmless. The past is not harmless. It watches, it warns, and it is never, ever truly gone.